Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm Eric Farnsworth, your series host. Ecuador is in transition. President Guillermo Lasso has closed Congress and called for new elections later this month. He's not running for re-election. It's a constitutional process, but nonetheless has deepened uncertainty. Depending on the outcome, the elections could threaten to return Ecuador to a recent past characterized by populism, personalism, and rejectionism. At a minimum, the country requires a modicum of renewed stability to attract investment and restore business confidence. This is not a new phenomenon. Ecuador has seemingly cascaded from crisis to crisis over the years, with popular agitation sparked by even the smallest political disagreements. What can we anticipate going forward? Stability or social unrest? Economic orthodoxy or policy reversal? Will upcoming elections cleanse the political palate and allow for a fresh start? Or will the people of Ecuador seek to return to a government built on the unmet promises of Correísmo? To discuss these issues, we have one of the more knowledgeable and distinguished observers of Ecuador in Washington, Risa Grais-Targow. She is Director for Latin America with Eurasia Group. Risa, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
Thanks for having me.
Were you surprised by what just happened?
Yes and no. President Lasso had been contemplating this option off and on through a lot of his administration. He had been threatening it, and the threat of dissolving Congress is a very useful tool to get lawmakers to cooperate with your agenda. But he lost a referendum in February, which he had hoped to use to strengthen his mandate. And coming out of that process, we saw corruption allegations against him gaining steam, a very obstructionist assembly, keen to use that to remove him. And once it became clear that he wasn't going to be able to stave off impeachment, he went for this kind of ultimate option of dissolving the assembly and calling for snap elections.
Were the calls for his impeachment groundless or grounded on something that was legitimate?
There were allegations, some questions about the validity of the claims, but I think ultimately it was a political process. He had been, he was a weak and unpopular president, and so there was popular support to move forward with his removal, as evidenced by the fact that the country's constitutional court, which many thought was a fairly technocratic body, ended up clearing the impeachment process to move forward.
It's unusual for a president to call for new elections and then not contest those elections. Was he just tired of being president?
I think he was contemplating the possibility of running, and certainly in the initial days following his move to call for the muerte cruzada, he left the door open. But I think he also looked at the polls, thought about his chances and decided that not running would allow him to kind of go out of office on his own terms rather than lose.
While he remains in office, what would you anticipate would be his agenda? What sort of things would you anticipate him attempting to accomplish during that time?
Yeah, so during this period, he can rule by decree, effectively issue laws by decree without the assembly. He's already put forward a tax reform that actually partially reverses tax hikes he himself introduced. He also,
sober second thought.
Yes. He also has put forward a law that would establish new free trade zones, which actually the court struck down. These laws do require the Constitutional Court sign off. It's unclear what else he's going to do, but I think some of the more kind of politically sensitive, controversial structural reforms that he wanted to do, here I'm talking about a labor reform, a kind of broader investment reform, I think he's going to stay away from, just because it would have the potential to spark significant social unrest, which so far, actually one of the surprising elements of this whole story is that we haven't seen any protests following his move to dissolve Congress, and I think he wants to keep it that way.
Yeah, keeping the streets calm, I think, has to be a goal of most leaders, no doubt. It's interesting. He had a somewhat orthodox economic agenda, which frankly attracted the attention and the interest of a lot of investors and folks who looked at the country favorably as a beacon, perhaps, in a complicated neighborhood. But perhaps that agenda wasn't overly popular in his own country, correct?
Yeah, I think what we saw is, Lasso was elected in 2021. It was kind of a surprise to
Very
many
much,
that
yeah.
he won election. And I think he won in large part because voters didn't want the alternative, which was former President Rafael Correa's candidate.
Yeah.
I think Lasso somewhat misinterpreted that victory as a mandate for his kind of neoliberal policies or libertarian policies, as it were. And the population, didn't necessarily agree with that. And so I think, he struggled to advance that agenda. I think in part because he didn't necessarily appreciate what the mandate was.
One of my regrets is that the United States, frankly, didn't respond as favorably to some of his overtures as I would have liked, and I think the Council would have liked as well. I think that'll be seen as a real missed opportunity when we go forward. It's one of those questions of history, what could have been, no? So let's turn to the elections. Of course, we're not going to ask anyone to predict the outcome, but there's a real possibility that the candidate of Rafael Correa, whom you've already brought into the conversation, could win. What is it about Ecuador that the people continue to flirt with, this failed populist approach to governance that has unleashed corruption and all kinds of things that people claim they don't want?
Well, the Correa years were, for the most part, very good years in terms of the economy and how voters felt about their personal well-being. Correa's 10 years coincided with very high oil prices. He used that oil windfall to really ramp up public spending on infrastructure, created jobs. And so I think it's that part of Correa's time in office that voters now recall quite fondly.
But you contrast that with what happened after him, and you make the populist mess, and the people that come after you have to clean it up, and then they get blamed for it. It's the irony of politics, no?
Yeah, both President Lenin Moreno, who succeeded Correa, and Lasso have had to undertake pretty significant adjustments.
Yeah.
Both worked with the IMF in order to do that, and obviously confronted, more delicate macroeconomic conditions, significant financing needs, and didn't benefit from the same kind of economic conditions that Correa did during his time in office.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn to a topic that is clearly on the front mind of many people across the region, corruption. Is that one of the issues that you think voters will be casting their ballots on this time?
It's less of an issue in this election than it has been in the recent past. The main voter issue in this election is actually security. So we've seen this across the region, but the deterioration of the security situation in Ecuador over the past couple of years has been really significant. And polls show that, across various surveys, 40% of voters will say that's the top problem in the country, followed by the economy, jobs, and inflation, those concerns. So I think this election is going to be about security and the economy. And that is a variable that I think works to Correa's advantage, because corruption is the issue that's more of a liability for him, but it's just less of a voter priority right now.
What can explain that spike in insecurity that we've seen? Is it drug trafficking? Is it migration flows from other countries? Is it economic concerns? What do you attribute it to?
It's all of the above, but I would say the main driver has been the increase in drug trafficking. And then as we've seen the kind of increase in drug trafficking out of Ecuador's coastal ports, there's been more conflicts among organized criminal groups for control of those routes.
And are those criminal groups from any particular country outside of Ecuador? Are they indigenous to Ecuador? Or what's
They're mostly from outside of Ecuador.
Yeah.
So the kind of regional criminal groups that are operating elsewhere.
So your supposition, if I can put words in your mouth, is that whoever is the president forthcoming would have to work internationally to help address some of these issues. This isn't something that he or she would be able to solve on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really significant challenge, and as we know from Colombia, Mexico, other recent experiences with a lot of insecurity, it's not an issue that's easy to tackle.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as we've seen elections across the region, insecurity and crime are really at the forefront of people's minds. And the reasons may be different, but the results are the same. So we're here talking about Ecuador with Risa Grais-Targow, who is with the Eurasia group, and talking about elections and the economy and all kinds of interesting things. One thing we haven't talked about yet is China's impact in Ecuador. China is a huge player in the Ecuadorian economy. Does that have a political impact as well?
Less of a political impact. For the most part, China has become an important source of financing over the years. During the Correa administration, Correa pursued a number of oil-backed loans with China, and it became an important source for him. Subsequent administrations have gone to China to renegotiate those loans, which has helped them in terms of their financing. And then we had Lasso himself actually pursuing a free trade agreement with China and looking to deepen ties there. I think if there's any political impact, it's that Lasso and previous administrations have tried to use the kind of China relationship to gain more leverage or interest in Washington and kind of use China's support for Ecuador to kind of play the U.S. and China off of each other in the hopes that that will garner stronger investment, financing, and deeper trade relations with Washington.
Have you seen any sort of impact or new interest among your clients, among investors, based on some of those issues, or are they totally separate?
I would say from an investor perspective, there's always interest in seeing a free trade agreement with the U.S., seeing strong U.S. support for Ecuador, especially when it comes to combating the security situation. Unfortunately, even though there's very strong rhetorical support from the U.S. in favor of Lasso's government, we haven't necessarily seen that translate to policies or kind of concrete support.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting looking forward because, again, depending on who's elected, the relationship with the United States could change yet again. When Correa was president, we saw what he did with Manta, the base that the U.S. used in terms of counter-narcotics operations. We saw what happened in terms of the overall relationship. And then, subsequent presidents tried to change that direction a little bit. Do you sense that it would return to the Correa years, or are we overthinking it here and it's going to be more benign?
I think Correa would, if he returns to power, his successor, he's backing a candidate named Luisa Gonzalez. He hopes to return himself in 2025. I think if he returns to power, he will absolutely look to engage with China. I think that he still views China as an important, potential partner. Would also probably try to kind of deepen integration with the other leftist governments in the region. But I also think that he would be somewhat more pragmatic when it comes to managing the U.S. relationship. And that's because the economic context today is very different than it was, kind of during the height of his, his popularity and his years in office. It's a much more challenging external backdrop. This is a dollarized economy that needs financing. And so I think because of that, he'll be, somewhat more moderate when it comes to managing the U.S. bilateral relationship.
It's interesting that other presidents, such as the president of Brazil, who have come back after relatively successful times in office earlier in the century, have found changed environments internationally, economic conditions. You can't just pick up where you left off, no?
Exactly. And we even saw from Correa a real shift in his posture towards the U.S., towards investors, towards Washington-based multilaterals during his time in office. So, at the beginning of his administration, when he really had a lot of economic flexibility, he was quite radical. He kind of broke ties with the multilaterals. He defaulted on the debt. And then towards the end of his time in office, he had a much more challenging economic environment, and he mended bridges with the multilaterals. He came back to bond markets. He reformed his own mining code, looking for investment. And so I think we already saw some of that shift happening during his 10 years in office. And we can expect something, I think, a Correa that looks more like the end of his 10 years than the beginning.
Would you anticipate that would translate also into a continuation of Ecuador's broader trade policy? I mean, in terms of efforts with the Pacific Alliance, you mentioned free trade negotiations with China, outreach to the Pacific Rim countries. I mean, or is that just not going to be much of a priority? And I know we're asking about the future and the speculation.
Yes.
Nobody's going to hold you to this, but these are issues that are on the minds of many people.
I think it would be less of a priority for him. I think if Correa's candidate wins, he's really going to be focused on consolidating his support ahead of the next election cycle. This is a kind of unusual election in that the authorities who are elected in August, or if we have a runoff in October, are only going to serve the remainder of Lasso's term.
Correct.
And so they will assume office in November and then immediately focus their attention on reelection in February 2025. So I think the priority in this kind of initial transition time for anyone who comes into power is going to be kind of consolidating their popular support and ensuring that they're able to win re-election in 2025.
But you said Correa might want to come back in 2025, so reading between the lines, if his candidate is elected in August, this is a stalking horse candidacy for Correa coming back, no?
Yes, absolutely. And he chose a ticket that is very loyal to him, precisely to ensure that he can achieve these political goals.
Yes.
His initial chosen successor, Lenin Moreno, ended up breaking with him.
It was ironic, wasn't it? That was one of the more interesting stories of the recent past.
Exactly. Kind of breaking with him, betraying him very early in his administration. And since then, we've seen Correa really prioritizing loyalty to make sure that he has a candidate that would kind of honor his own political objectives.
As they say, the currency of politics is loyalty, and I think we'll figure that out if it really occurs. There are a lot of variables that have to happen, of course, to get to that point, but it is interesting to look into the not too distant future to see what could happen. Well, in order to consolidate his support, he's going to have support of the indigenous community, or at least a portion of it. No, the indigenous community in Ecuador is very large, very powerful, has some very important demands, plays an important role in the economy. What's the strategy there? How does one govern Ecuador effectively in an inclusive, growing manner that fully incorporates indigenous community as partners? Is that possible?
It's a real challenge. I think the indigenous movement in Ecuador is among the most organized in the region. It's always been an important actor, but I think its weight in local political and social dynamics has really grown since the 2019 protests that erupted. We also had massive indigenous protests last year that also almost took out President Lasso in that moment. And so I think with this kind of more empowered indigenous movement, it's going to be a challenge for any administration. Now, we do have an indigenous candidate on the ballot, Yaku Perez, and I think, if he wins...
Who did well in the previous elections.
He almost made it to the runoff in 2021. He's actually one of the candidates who's leading very early polls. So if he wins, I think that would be obviously a very different dynamic where he has the indigenous movement behind him. If it's someone else, I think managing those relationships is going to be a challenge, including for Correa. I think there's kind of some overlap in terms of more leftist policy proposals where the Indigenous Party, Pachakutik, would be willing to support him. We've also seen the indigenous movement quite divided, and I think there is a faction of the indigenous movement that's more aligned with Correísmo. That being said, I think extractive sectors are an area that's going to be a kind of permanent source of conflict. And so to the extent that Correa himself is very pro-oil, pro-mining, views those sectors as a really critical way to attract foreign direct investment into the economy, I think that's going to ensure some degree of confrontation with the indigenous.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We've seen that throughout the region, not just Ecuador, obviously. Would you anticipate, and again, speculation for sure, but Bolivia went all in on indigenous leadership and to the point where policies really have flown from that over the course of the last 20-some years. Is that an option for Ecuador? Is that a possibility? I mean, that would fundamentally reform the economy. Or are the economic, pillars so much in place that you might be able to, do some changes around the edges, but you're really not going to reform much because of the extractive sector, because of the agriculture sector? Let's talk about that just a little bit.
I think there have been certain policies put in place, even in Correa's own constitution, that sought to kind of incorporate the indigenous. And maybe if we have Yaku Perez, the indigenous candidate, winning, we would see a more concerted effort in that direction. But otherwise, I see a lot of factors, including the structure of the economy, as you mentioned, that would make that difficult in the near term.
Do you see any chance that the elections that we're talking about will not be run in a free and fair manner, or can we have full confidence in the electoral system in Ecuador that whoever maintains the most votes is the legitimate president-elect?
I think we can have confidence in this system. And I think one thing that's really interesting about this political moment in Ecuador, I think all Ecuador watchers and locals were really scared about the prospect of this muerte cruzada, precisely because we thought it was going to trigger kind of social chaos, institutional chaos, a constitutional crisis, the kind of worst case scenario you could imagine from a political, social, and institutional perspective. And the amazing thing is that the day after, everyone kind of had a sigh of relief and seemed to very immediately turn their attention towards these new elections, I think as a chance to kind of reset politically following this 2 years of Lasso's administration, which was just characterized by constant confrontation between the government and the assembly, between the government and Indigenous. And so, at least for now, I think there's a kind of consensus from across the political spectrum that these elections are necessary.
I think it's really an important point you're making, and we're seeing it in other countries too, in terms of, it's not one president or the other necessarily, it's people are just exhausted coming out of 3 years of COVID and economic challenges and protests, and don't forget, before COVID, we had the year of 2019, which riots and protests across the region, and Ecuador was certainly no exception there. So this trend has been going for some time. I mean, you have to wonder, at what point do people just get so exhausted they just say, I'm just done with this. In the recent Guatemalan elections, we had an abstention rate that was huge.
Yes.
Right? And I think we can anticipate that in some other elections going forward. Is that a phenomenon in Ecuador, or is Ecuador somehow different?
So we did actually see a similar phenomenon in 2021 when Yaku Perez, the Indigenous candidate, didn't make it into the runoff. He told all of his voters to go abstain, vote
home.
null, and that actually really helped Lasso ultimately to beat Correa's candidate, Andres Arauz. So we already saw that kind of rejection or anger vote materializing in 2021. We'll have to see if it happens again in August.
We will indeed, and I hope you'll come back to talk to us at Democracy Dialogues once we know the results and where we're going with Ecuador and other countries in the region. Risa, it's been a delight talking to you and to have you here with us today. And I want to thank all of you as well for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues, where each month we explore the most pressing issues of democracy in the Americas. Find us here on YouTube at the beginning of each month, or watch past episodes at www.as-coa.org/Democracy Dialogues. Until then, let's continue to work together to ensure that democracy delivers for all of us.